Picture this. You're a 12-year-old girl in 15th century England, dressed in silks finer than you've ever touched, walking through the echoing chapel of Bletsoe Castle. Candles drip wax onto the stone floor, nobles murmur blessings, and a priest intones Latin that you barely understand. For a moment it feels like a dream. You are being called lady, praised as the bride of a great lord. But dreams end quickly. Your new husband, Edmund Tudor, is twice your age, ambitious, and in a hurry to claim what your bloodline can offer him. You are not a wife. You are a vessel. That wedding mass was not a promise of safety, but the opening act of a nightmare. Within a year, you are 13, carried to Pembroke Castle, where another ceremony begins, not of gold and incense, but of blood and agony. Because the Tudors demand proof of their investment, they demand a child. And now, on a freezing winter night, your screams echo through the stone halls as the boy who will one day become Henry VII tears his way into the world through your broken body. And if you think this is brutal, just wait, because Margaret Beaufort's story only gets darker. So before we open the Tudor Dynasty's blood-soaked origins, hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe, because what comes next will make you question how far a kingdom will go to survive. Because Margaret was not just any girl. She carried the blood of kings in her veins, tracing her descent to John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, son of Edward III. In 15th century England, that lineage was a double-edged sword, a blessing that gave her claim to the throne, and a curse that marked her as a pawn in a ruthless game where royal blood could make you either a prize or a target. Her path to that freezing night at Pembroke Castle began long before. Born in May 1443 at Bletsoe, the daughter of John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and Margaret Beauchamp, she entered a world already shadowed by disgrace. Her father returned from France defeated, his campaigns in ruins. Within a year, he was dead, officially of fever, though whispers spoke of poison or suicide. Margaret was just 1 year old, already fatherless, her future dictated by dynastic calculation rather than her own will. At 6, she was promised to John de la Pole, son of the Duke of Suffolk. It was a match forged to fuse two great families, but politics is a fickle master. Suffolk was accused of treason for surrendering English lands in France, and his downfall was as violent as it was swift. Dragged from a ship, hacked to death with a rusty sword, his head only severed after 6 blows. His body washed up headless on the English shore. For little Margaret, the betrothal dissolved in blood. Lesson 1. In England's game of power, promises meant nothing. Soon after, her fate was bound to the Tudors. Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, half-brother to King Henry VI, was chosen as her husband. He was in his 20s, battle-tested, ambitious, and keenly aware of the advantage her bloodline could bring. Margaret was 12. The marriage was not delayed. It was consummated at once, as custom demanded. Childhood was a luxury she would never be granted. Beneath Beaufort tapestries, Margaret lost the last remnants of girlhood. She never spoke of it, but her silence was an indictment. Her body would never fully recover. For Edmund, Margaret was an investment. For the crown, she was a vessel. For herself, she was only a girl who had no choice. Yet the vows she whispered at Bletsoe bound her to a destiny larger than she could imagine. And when Edmund marched to war against Yorkist enemies, leaving her pregnant and alone, Margaret bore not only his child, but also the weight of history itself. Her story, the story of the Tudors, was already being written in blood, silence, and sacrifice. The year was 1456. Margaret, not yet 13, was already a bride. Soon she would be a widow. Her husband, Edmund Tudor, had gone to war in South Wales, leading Lancastrian forces against their Yorkist rivals. He was ambitious, hardened by battle, and certain that fortune would favor his cause. But the Wars of the Roses had no patience for certainty. In the autumn, he was captured at Carmarthen Castle. The walls that had once seemed impregnable became his prison. The official story claimed he died of plague, a common and convenient explanation for sudden death in cramped medieval strongholds. But plague was also the perfect cover for murder. Edmund was young, strong, and politically dangerous. Some said his captors hastened his end with poison or a knife in the dark. Whatever the truth, by November 1456, he was gone. Margaret, barely into her teens, was left a widow, pregnant, landless, and frighteningly alone. Her body was still changing, still half child, half woman. Now it carried the future of the Tudor line. Her brother-in-law, Jasper Tudor, stepped into the role of protector. He was not much older than Edmund, but he understood the stakes. Margaret's unborn child could be the hope of Lancaster, or, if fate turned cruel, the end of their family's ambition. Jasper brought her to his stronghold at Pembroke Castle, perched high above the sea on sheer limestone cliffs. The journey itself was torture. The roads were treacherous with ice. Her litter jolted endlessly over ruts and stones. Winter winds tore at the fabric curtains, cutting through even the heaviest furs. Every bump sent pain through her fragile body. Every mile pushed her further toward exhaustion. She was a girl carrying a kingdom's gamble, dragged across the frozen spine of Wales toward a fortress that smelled of salt, smoke, and survival. Pembroke was no royal palace. Its round keep had stood against sieges for centuries, but its stone corridors were damp and bitterly cold. Fires devoured wood by the cartload, yet barely touched the chill that seeped through the walls. In one drafty chamber, hung with tapestries that fluttered. Like sails in the wind, Margaret prepared to endure her ordeal. The physician, Lewis Carolyn, had attended queens and noble ladies, studied in Oxford and Paris, and carried with him the wisdom of Galen and Hippocrates. Yet when he examined Margaret, his face betrayed what his lips did not. She was too small, her hips too narrow, the child too large. The birth would be dangerous, perhaps impossible. Jasper Tudor, only 24, listened in silence. If Margaret died, the Tudor claim might die with her. If the child was lost, all their sacrifices would mean nothing. And so they waited, through the howling of the sea winds, for nature to take its course. Margaret, meanwhile, turned inward. Each day she knelt in Pembroke's chapel, lips moving in whispered prayers until her knees bled against the cold stone floor. She prayed not only for survival, but for meaning. If she must suffer, let it be for something greater than herself. Faith became both refuge and weapon, a shield against despair. Her attendants noted the intensity of her devotion, the way she clung to the Psalms like a drowning child to driftwood. Later, historians would say that this was when her obsession with religion took root, not as piety, but as survival. And then, in January 1457, labor came. It began on the battlements, where she had been urged to walk for her health. The first contraction struck like lightning, folding her small body in two. She was carried back to her chamber, her cries echoing against the stone. The midwives, Dame Gwenfurch Dafydd and her assistants, knew this was no ordinary birth. They burned herbs to purify the air. Lavender for calm, rosemary for strength, rue for protection. They sharpened knives, laid out hooks and forceps, instruments whose very presence revealed their doubts that both mother and child would live. For 18 hours, Margaret screamed, her voice growing hoarse until only guttural gasps escaped. The chamber was a furnace of sweat, blood, and whispered prayers. Outside, Jasper paced endlessly, the thud of his boots marking each minute that passed. Servants rushed in and out with basins of steaming water, their faces pale. Finally, the midwives made their choice. Dame Gwen, invoking Saint Margaret of Antioch, the patron saint of childbirth, attempted a risky manual extraction. Her hands worked with desperate precision, and then, at last, the chamber fell silent. A heartbeat later, silence broke with the thin, furious cry of an infant. Henry Tudor had entered the world. Margaret, her body torn and bleeding, lay limp on the bed, hovering on the knife edge of death. She was too weak even to lift her arms, but when they placed the swaddled child on her chest, she turned her head, eyes wide, and fixed him with a gaze that seared itself into her memory. She had given England a son, but the cost was ruinous. Her injuries were permanent. The physician recorded tearing so severe it left her barren. At 13, her body was broken, beyond repair. She would never bear another child. For weeks she drifted in and out of fever, her attendants spooning broth past cracked lips, praying over her as she shivered under heavy quilts. Each breath was borrowed, each sunrise uncertain. She survived, but the ordeal carved scars deeper than flesh. She woke screaming from nightmares, flinching at touch, half fearing her child's cry as a reminder of the agony that brought him forth. And yet, within that frail, wounded girl lay iron. Margaret Beaufort would live. She would adapt. And she would devote every breath not to her own comfort, but to the survival of the son whose first cry had nearly killed her. This is how dynasties are born, not in triumph, but in blood and sacrifice, in the shattering of a child's body to deliver the future of a kingdom. Margaret Beaufort survived the birth of her son, but she emerged from that chamber changed forever. She was 13, widowed, and permanently scarred by childbirth. Her body had been broken, her girlhood stolen, yet her will remained. And in that fragile frame lay the mother of a dynasty. Henry, her infant son, was placed under the protection of Jasper Tudor, who swore to safeguard the boy as though he were his own. But Margaret herself had to face a new reality. In a kingdom splintering into civil war, a girl alone with royal blood was both vulnerable and dangerous. Survival meant remarriage. By 1458, only a year after her agonizing ordeal, Margaret was once again led to the altar. This time, her husband was Sir Henry Stafford, younger son of the Duke of Buckingham. The wedding was quiet, stripped of the pomp that had once surrounded her union with Edmund Tudor. No lavish feasts, no pageantry, just a contract. It was not a marriage of affection, but of necessity. Stafford was pragmatic, cautious, and above all, politically useful. He leaned toward the Yorkist faction, which made him valuable as a shield. For Margaret, still frail in body and haunted by memory, the match offered protection. She had estates to defend, a son's inheritance to secure, and enemies on every side. With Stafford, she could at least carve out a fragile peace. The arrangement was carefully negotiated. Margaret retained control of her Beaufort estates, a rare concession for a medieval woman, and one that spoke volumes about her determination to safeguard her son's future. Stafford, in turn, pledged to provide military protection and political cover. It was less a marriage bed than a battlefield treaty. Yet even within this cautious alliance, Margaret's mind never rested. She learned the language of estate management, poring over ledgers, charters, and contracts, until she could balance accounts with the precision of any steward. She studied law, history, and theology with the focus of a scholar. Her household became a school, each lesson another weapon sharpened for survival. Outside the castle walls, England burned. The Wars of the Roses intensified into a cycle of battles, betrayals, and bloody retributions. At Towton in 1461, the largest battle ever fought on English soil, the Yorkists under Edward IV crushed the Lancastrians. The snow that fell on that Palm Sunday mingled with rivers of blood, 30,000 dead in a single day. The Lancastrian cause, Margaret's cause, lay shattered. And yet, even as thrones toppled and kings were crowned, Margaret learned the most valuable lesson of all. Victory did not always belong to the strongest sword, but to those who could endure. She watched, listened, and began weaving quiet connections. Women in particular became her allies, wives and widows who shared information across household boundaries, slipping past the notice of men too busy drawing their swords. In a world where men ruled with steel, women ruled with whispers. Her faith, too, grew sharper, more purposeful. What had begun as desperate prayers on a cold chapel floor evolved into a lifelong conviction that her suffering had been chosen for a reason. She fasted, confessed, and gave generously to the church, not only out of devotion, but also as strategy. The language of religion cloaked her ambition, making her appear pious, dutiful, harmless, when in truth, she was learning to play a much longer game. Modern readers might wonder at her resilience. How could a child mother, broken by her first birth, step back into the political fray so quickly? The truth is stark. She had no choice. In 15th century England, survival for women was transactional. Marriages were not unions of love, but contracts of power. To refuse meant erasure. And for Margaret, refusal was never an option. The years with Henry Stafford brought her something she had lacked before: time. Time to recover her health, to build her knowledge, to quietly nurture alliances. Stafford was not unkind, but he was pragmatic above all. He fought for Edward IV, earning scars and bitterness in service to a Yorkist king. Margaret tended his wounds, listened to his complaints, and used his position as cover for her own loyalties to Lancaster. All the while, her son Henry grew up far from her in Jasper Tudor's custody. She saw him rarely, her role as mother reduced to letters and prayers. Each visit was a dagger of longing, watching him grow taller, sharper, more distant, before being torn from her arms again. But even in absence, she bound herself to his future. Every ledger she balanced, every prayer she whispered, every alliance she secured, each was another stone laid on the road to her son's eventual claim. By the late 1460s, Margaret was no longer just a survivor. She was becoming something far rarer, a strategist. She had learned to bend with the winds of war, to mask her true loyalties behind a veil of obedience. And while kings bled each other dry on battlefields, Margaret Beaufort was learning how to outlast them all. Her transformation from victim to operator was nearly complete. All she needed now was opportunity, and opportunity would arrive, carried on the tide of exile, rebellion, and betrayal. The year 1461 changed everything. Snow fell thick on the fields of Towton as swords clashed and arrows darkened the sky. When the slaughter ended, the red rose of Lancaster lay crushed beneath the white rose of York. Edward IV was crowned king, and the Lancastrians scattered like hunted prey. For Margaret Beaufort, the danger was immediate. She carried in her veins Lancastrian blood, and in her son, Henry Tudor, an heir whose very existence could ignite rebellion. The boy was still a child, yet already a threat to a crown. Margaret knew one truth with terrifying clarity. Survival demanded invisibility. Her marriage to Henry Stafford offered some protection. As a Yorkist sympathizer, he shielded her from suspicion, but her son's existence hung over them like a sword. What would Edward IV do if he saw in young Henry not an orphaned boy, but a rival claimant? Margaret lived in constant fear that soldiers might ride up the road one morning, demanding her child's head. And so she adapted. She became a master of silence, cultivating relationships with women on both sides of the conflict. She corresponded with Elizabeth Woodville, the New Yorkist queen, while quietly maintaining ties to Margaret of Anjou, the exiled Lancastrian queen in France. These connections, fragile as spiderwebs, kept her informed while keeping her alive. In a world where men negotiated with armies, Margaret learned to negotiate with trust and secrets. But the separation from her son was agony. Jasper Tudor raised Henry in Wales, teaching him to ride, to speak Welsh, to command loyalty from rough men of the borderlands. Margaret saw him rarely, perhaps once or twice a year. Each meeting was bittersweet. The boy, taller than before, more of a stranger, before being taken from her arms again. She poured her motherhood into letters, carefully coded to avoid Yorkist spies, sending gifts of books and clothes, each one a desperate attempt to remain present in a life she could not share. Then came 1471, the turning point. The Lancastrians, briefly restored by the scheming kingmaker Warwick, were crushed at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Prince Edward, the last legitimate son of Henry VI, was killed. Some say on the field, others whisper by cold steel after surrender. Within weeks, Henry VI himself was dead in the Tower of London, murdered, most believed, on Richard of Gloucester's orders. The Lancastrian line had been extinguished, all except one, Margaret's son. Henry Tudor, barely 14, became the last viable heir of Lancaster. A boy with a distant claim through the Beaufort line suddenly carried the full weight of a broken dynasty. That made him both hope and target. Jasper Tudor knew what must be done. The boy could not remain in Wales, where Yorkist patrols hunted every shadow. So, on a storm-lashed night in September 1471, Henry Tudor was smuggled to the coast. At Tenby, with rain lashing the cliffs and enemy soldiers closing in, he boarded a small ship bound for Brittany. He left England a hunted exile, beginning 14 years of uncertainty. Margaret was not there to see him go. She learned of it days later, the news carried by a breathless messenger. The knowledge struck her like a blade. Her son, the child she had nearly died to bring into the world, was now beyond the sea, cast into the hands of strangers. She had no way of knowing if she would ever see him again. Imagine her grief. For years she had been denied the warmth of his daily presence, consoling herself with the thought that at least he was still within England's borders, still under Jasper's watchful eye. Now even that fragile comfort was gone. The channel itself had become a wall between them. Each tide that rolled against Pembroke's cliffs reminded her of the sun carried far beyond her reach. In Brittany, Henry's life was precarious. Duke Francis II sheltered him, but the boy was a pawn as much as a guest. To the French, he was a bargaining chip, an English claimant who might be used in negotiations, traded, or betrayed if the winds of politics shifted. Exile was no freedom. It was another kind of captivity. Back in England, Margaret carried her loss like armor. She turned grief into ambition. If she could not cradle her son, she would build a world for his return. Each letter she sent, coded in riddles and hidden beneath the language of trade or family matters, was a lifeline across the sea. She bribed merchants, diplomats, even pilgrims to carry messages, each one a fragile thread in the web she was weaving. Every morning she rose with the same question. Was her son alive? Every night she prayed that the answer would still be yes. It was a mother's agony sharpened into political determination. For Margaret Beaufort, the exile of her son was no ending. It was the beginning of her transformation from pawn to player, from victim to mastermind. She could no longer cling to the role of grieving child mother. Instead, she became something else entirely. The woman who would plot, maneuver, and scheme across decades to put her exiled son on England's throne. The Wars of the Roses had burned her world to ash. From that ash, Margaret Beaufort began to forge iron. When Henry Tudor vanished into exile, Margaret Beaufort was left with little more than faith and determination. But from those ashes she began to reinvent herself, not as a grieving widow, not as a fragile mother, but as a strategist. If she could not hold her son in her arms, she would shape the kingdom he would return to. Her second husband, Henry Stafford, died in 1471, leaving her once more a widow. This time, however, Margaret was not the helpless girl of Pembroke Castle. She was approaching 30, hardened by loss, sharpened by survival, and she knew her next marriage could not be about protection alone. It had to be about power. Her choice was Thomas Stanley, Lord Stanley of Lancashire. He was no romantic hero, but he was a master of the one skill that mattered most in a world torn by civil war: survival. Stanley had perfected the art of waiting to choose a side until the very last moment, always ensuring he backed the eventual winner. His soldiers were numerous, his influence vast, his instincts razor-sharp. The marriage was a pact of convenience, a chess move rather than a love story. For Stanley, Margaret brought Beaufort blood, a prestigious connection to the Lancastrian legacy. For Margaret, Stanley offered political cover, military might, and access to networks of power that stretched across England. Together, they formed a partnership of cold calculation, two survivors whose alliance could shift the balance of power. But marriage alone was not enough. Margaret began to build something unprecedented, an intelligence network that spanned England and reached across the Channel into Brittany. Merchants, monks, servants, even traveling pilgrims became her eyes and ears. Letters were written in code, hidden inside bales of wool or sewn into clothing. Invisible ink carried secret messages across the sea. Through this web, she kept watch over her son. Every rumor of his health, every whisper of danger, every rumor of French or Yorkist schemes reached her ears. At a time when kings often knew less about their own subjects than Margaret did, she became England's quiet spy master. Meanwhile, Edward IV still reigned. But in April 1483, the unexpected happened. The king died suddenly, leaving his 12-year-old son as heir. A child king meant a regency and an opportunity for predators. Into that void stepped Richard, Duke of Gloucester, Edward's ambitious brother. He seized the throne, locking the boy king and his younger brother in the Tower of London. The princes were never seen alive again. The disappearance of the princes destroyed Yorkist legitimacy. Whispers spread like wildfire. Richard had murdered children to seize the crown. Even among hardened nobles, the act seemed monstrous. And in that moment of shock, Margaret saw what few others dared to dream: an opening. Her son, Henry Tudor, long dismissed as an exile with a distant claim, suddenly looked like a viable alternative. If Richard was a child murderer, if Yorkist rule was poisoned by blood and betrayal, then perhaps the realm would accept a Lancastrian king, especially one who could unite the houses by marrying Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's eldest daughter. Margaret acted with breathtaking audacity. From her home in England, she began to plot open rebellion. She reached out to Bishop John Morton, a brilliant strategist imprisoned by Richard, and together they laid plans. Messages sailed across the Channel to Brittany, where Henry Tudor waited. They conspired not only for Henry's return, but for his coronation as king. It was treason of the highest order. Discovery meant death. Yet Margaret pressed forward, her letters encrypted, her servants sworn to silence. She coordinated the timing of risings in England with plans for Henry to sail from exile, aligning nobles, merchants, and foreign allies into a fragile coalition. The first attempt in 1483 failed. Betrayals exposed the plot. Rebellions crumbled. Henry's invasion fleet scattered in storms. Richard III unleashed executions across England, punishing traitors with no mercy. And yet, Margaret survived. Her marriage to Stanley shielded her. Richard could not afford to alienate one of his most powerful lords. Still, punishment came. She was placed under house arrest, stripped of her titles, her movements watched. To the world, it seemed Margaret Beaufort had been broken. But appearances were her greatest disguise. Even confined, she continued her work, passing messages through servants, priests, and women in her household. Her faith became her mask. Who would suspect that the pious, fasting widow, forever bent in prayer, was orchestrating conspiracies against a king? For years she endured in silence, her networks rebuilding in the shadows. Across the sea, Henry grew into a man. Each coded letter between mother and son was a thread binding them together across distance and danger. Margaret's instructions were clear. Wait, bide your time, and when England is ready, return with fire. Richard's usurpation had turned the tide. The princes in the Tower were gone, Edward IV was dead, and Yorkist legitimacy lay in ruins. In the vacuum, Margaret Beaufort emerged not as a pawn, but as the architect of a dynasty. The child who once screamed in agony on a Pembroke bed was gone. In her place stood a woman who could move armies with whispers and topple kings with patience. She had become England's most dangerous mother, a mastermind who would stop at nothing until her exiled son wore a crown. August 1485. The winds shifted at last. Henry Tudor, after 14 years of exile, landed at Milford Haven in Wales with a modest army of French mercenaries and loyal supporters. It was a desperate gamble, an invasion against Richard III, whose forces far outnumbered his own. Yet the gamble had been prepared, cultivated, and sharpened for years by one woman, his mother. As Henry marched through Wales, men rallied to his banner. Old loyalties resurfaced, and Jasper Tudor's influence drew Welsh chieftains to the cause. But the decisive moment would come not in Wales nor in France, but on a muddy field near Market Bosworth. On August 22, 1485, Richard III rode to battle in his crown, convinced of victory. He had crushed rebellions before, and Henry was just another pretender. But Richard had not accounted for Margaret Beaufort, or the husband she had chosen with such cold precision. Thomas Stanley and his brother William commanded thousands of soldiers, their allegiance uncertain as the armies prepared for battle. Richard expected their loyalty. Henry prayed for their betrayal. Margaret had worked tirelessly to ensure the latter, weaving whispers into her husband's ear, pressing upon him the wisdom of survival over loyalty. The battle raged in the summer heat, steel against steel, the mud soaked with blood. At its climax, Richard saw Henry across the field. In a moment of reckless courage, he charged, determined to kill the pretender with his own hand. His horse thundered through the melee, cutting down men in his path. For a brief, breathless moment, it seemed as though Richard might succeed. Then, the Stanley brothers moved. Their forces, which had held back in careful neutrality, surged forward, not for Richard but for Henry. Betrayal turned the tide. Surrounded, Richard fought like a lion, refusing to flee. Chroniclers say he fell hacking and slashing until the very end, crying, "Treason! Treason!" as he was cut down in the mud. His crown, knocked from his head, was retrieved and placed upon Henry Tudor's brow. Against all odds, Margaret's son was king. Henry VII's first act was to unite the houses of Lancaster and York by marrying Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's daughter. The union gave England what it had craved for decades: peace. The Wars of the Roses were over. The Tudor rose, red and white entwined, became the symbol of a new dynasty. For Margaret, the triumph was deeply personal. She had spent her life denied the simple joys of motherhood, separated from her child, broken by politics, scarred by trauma. Yet she had never stopped fighting for him. And now, her sacrifice was vindicated. But victory came at a cost. Margaret and Henry never shared the easy warmth of mother and son. Years of distance had forged their bond into something more political than personal. She was not merely mother anymore. She was "My Lady, the King's Mother," a title she insisted upon, outranking even the Queen in ceremony. She sat at the center of power, advising her son, guiding his policies, and ensuring that the fragile Tudor dynasty took root. She devoted herself to education and religion, founding colleges at Cambridge, sponsoring scholars and endowing chapels. Her piety was real, but it was also the language through which she secured her legacy. She remained a figure both revered and feared at court, an old woman in black, sharp-eyed, never to be underestimated. In 1509, Margaret Beaufort watched her grandson crowned as Henry VIII, the fiery prince who would transform England in ways no one could yet imagine. Days later, she died, her body finally succumbing after a lifetime of endurance. She was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, her tomb of black marble carved with the Latin inscription, Margareta, mother of Henry VII, grandmother of Henry VIII. But no inscription, however elegant, could capture the truth of her life. She had been a pawn, a child bride, a broken mother. She had been widowed, exiled, and imprisoned, and yet she had endured. She had outmaneuvered kings, toppled a tyrant, and built a dynasty from the fragile body of a girl who should not have survived her first childbirth. If you walk the echoing halls of Pembroke Castle today, you can still hear the Atlantic winds howl through the arrow slits, the same winds that rattled the chamber where a 13-year-old girl screamed as she brought Henry Tudor into the world. That cry, half agony and half defiance, was the beginning of a new age. It was the cry that ended the Wars of the Roses. The child who suffered became the mother of a dynasty. And through blood, faith, and unyielding will, Margaret Beaufort ensured that her name and her son's crown would never be forgotten.